The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, after all the years of you and I doing this show, I cannot believe that here we are yet again going to do another show on the Sri Lankan debt trap narrative. Now, for those of you who are familiar with our archives, we've done this show a number of times before in the past, but yet here we are again, in part because this is such a durable story, and in part because also it's back in the news in a number of different ways. So last week, the Chinese Foreign Ministry started raising the issue quite a bit. We first heard it at one of the press briefings in Beijing that was hosted by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian. He's the OG wolf warrior, for those of you who are not familiar with him. He was asked a question by a Chinese journalist, and you can hear in the way that the journalist is going to ask the question, I'm going to play you the sound, how rehearsed everything is at these press briefings in Beijing. She's literally reading from a script in what we can only assume is a planted or orchestrated or choreographed question. But let's first take a listen to the question, and that really speaks to some of the key issues that we're going to talk about today.
Sri Lankan Foreign Minister Ali Sabri recently said that China respects the requests of Sri Lanka and has never forced Sri Lanka to take loans from China. China has provided many financial support and humanitarian assistance in various ways for Sri Lanka, and the so-called debt trap is only a Western narrative. He also said that China has always been a close friend, and the two countries jointly celebrate the Rubber Rice Pact anniversary. What is your comment?
We
welcome the statement by Foreign Minister Ali Sabri. His remarks serve as a strong rebuttal to the unfounded narrative of China's debt trap in Sri Lanka for some time. I would like to reiterate that China never attaches political conditions.
Okay, so his answer is actually not that interesting here. There's one really important point that I want to bring up to you, is the Chinese continually frame this issue around Western narratives. And you heard that in the question. Zhao also used that in his response. Really, really important to emphasize that the debt trap narrative was not invented by the West. And today, it's no longer its main propagator. It was invented by Indian pundit Brahma Cheleni in 2017. And if you do a search on YouTube for Sri Lanka debt trap, you're going to see 99% of the references are Indian media references. So really important there. That being said, the issue came back up again just a few days later last week when then Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning, she responded to questions about the debt restructuring process that's underway. Now, for those of you who have not been following this, there is a massive economic crisis that is unfolding in Sri Lanka and that has been underway for about a year now. It's a political crisis, it's a financial crisis, it's just an all-around just terrible situation there. Unlike some other developing countries like Zambia and even Angola and Chad, where there has been a debt restructuring process, there's been very, very little movement on restructuring Sri Lanka's $37.6 billion external debt. That being said, we got word from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that they are going to allow for the cooperation and support the cooperation of international financial institutions. And the headline on Xinhua came out as China calls for joint efforts to ease Sri Lanka's debt burden. Now, that headline on Xinhua is very important because a lot of people have been seeing China as the main stumbling block in getting to an IMF deal that will then pave the way for the creditor committee to get together, and that's all of the major external creditors, to sort something out. Now, Cobus, the problem with this creditor committee, if it gets formed, I don't think it's formed yet, but unlike in Zambia, where it was basically private bondholders and the Chinese, in Sri Lanka we have a situation where it's the Japanese, the Indians, and the Chinese who would be on this creditor committee. Now, for those of you who don't follow politics here in Asia, those three countries do not get along with each other at all, specifically the Chinese and the Japanese and the Chinese and the Indians. So reaching some kind of consensus among those creditors is going to be very, very difficult. So the fact that China is signaling that it's okay for everybody to work together could be interpreted as a very important breakthrough on this. So Cobus, that is the background of the situation. One of the hallmarks of Sri Lanka, of course, is the Port of Hambantota. And that has stood up as the poster child for the debt trap narrative that has now been so durable in India, also in the West. We still see it pop up quite a bit. Why do you think this particular narrative has been so persistent, despite the fact that there's been so much evidence, including that from the researchers we're going to speak with today, that refutes the allegation?
I think there's something very concrete about the idea that you take out a big loan and then if you can't pay it, then they come and take your port. There's something about it that seems to make sense from people's experiences with domestic debt, and it just sounds like something that would be correct. The problem is that it isn't correct, and that the discussion around it has obscured so many other problems that we see in relation to lending in the global south, and particularly now as we see a kind of a series of kind of debt distress incidents starting to kind of sweep across the global south. It's more important than ever to actually talk in realistic terms about what these issues are. But, kind of the problem is that you're either someone who is deeply interested in these issues and following them and therefore okay with all of the acronyms and all of the technicalities, or you're not, in which case you're kind of sitting duck for these kind of oversimplified narratives that end up sounding like they make sense but actually don't make sense.
Well, if you have an inkling of doubt as to whether or not the debt trap narrative, as it's been framed in Sri Lanka about the Port of Hambantota, is true or might be true, then you're going to want to listen to our conversation today, and you're going to want to read the new report from the China Africa Research Initiative that published a brand new fascinating report called Evolution of Chinese Lending to Sri Lanka Since the Mid-2000s, Separating Myth from Reality, again published by CARI. For those of you who follow these debt issues quite closely, that name CARI may sound familiar to you. Of course, that is the home of Professor Deborah Browdegem, who has been discussing and researching these issues in an African context for many, many years now. This new report was written by Umesh Moramudali, who is a lecturer at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka, where he focuses on public finance and political economy. Also, Thilina Panduwawala, who is the head of economic research at the private economic advisory firm Frontier Research, also based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. A good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. It's a pleasure to be joining.
Thank you very much, Eric. Happy to be here.
Thilina, let's start with you. You titled the report Separating Myth from Reality. Let's kind of give us an overview now of what were some of the myths you were trying to address and what were some of the realities. Very briefly, lay that out for us.
Thanks, Eric. So one myth and, what we, and a starting point for us in the paper was in terms of how much of Sri Lanka's public external debt was owed to China. Because when we look at the data and when we look at how the discourse around those numbers has been, we've seen that the most quoted in media and in discourse, in social media, is that Sri Lanka owes about 10 to 15% of public external debt to China. But when we dig into the numbers, we realize that it was about actually close to 20%. And eventually for in 2021, we came up with a number of 19.6%. And that is one of the key, ones where starting points for us in terms of separating, the myths from realities in terms of the numbers, the debt numbers. And we thought that was a very important thing to clarify, because there's also, alongside this, China debt trap narrative, there's also this narrative about hidden debt. And the moment, you have, the number goes above that, popularly discussed 10 to 15%, then you have these claims of, China has hidden debt to Sri Lanka, and that's now coming out. And we wanted to really clarify, look, where this debt is, and that the state institutions in Sri Lanka have been keeping track of these debt numbers, have been recording them. It's just that it's a complicated process of where they're recorded, and for someone who is new to the topic, who's looking at Sri Lanka from the outside, it's not always easy to find out those numbers because of the way some of Sri Lanka's public institutions have been recording them, and some of Sri Lanka's practices in terms of doing that. So that is a big chunk of the clarification we wanted to bring out in terms of the debt numbers.
Umesh, let's step back for a moment. You've been following this unfolding crisis for several years, and while you were working on this particular project, Sri Lanka itself started kind of entering into higher and higher levels of debt distress. So I wonder if you could just give us an idea of like how Sri Lankan society has been impacted by this crisis.
Well, this is by far the worst economic crisis that Sri Lanka has been grappling with since the independence. We gained independence in 1948 from the British, and since then, this is the worst economic crisis. How it has impacted people is like, I'll give few anecdotal evidence. Few months ago, we had power cuts ranging from 10 to 12 hours a day, which means for the most part of the day, Sri Lanka didn't have power. People couldn't work, people couldn't, go out, or hospitals couldn't function, and many more others. And Sri Lanka didn't have fuel. There were many fuel queues, fuel were rationed. Fuel is still rationed, but fuel were rationed in a much more serious way a few months ago. This really, affected the people, and then that also turned into a political crisis. People were very unhappy about the fact that the government cannot provide the basic necessities. People couldn't get even cooking gas. You can't cook, you don't have electricity, you can't work. Literally, the everyday life was becoming a living hell. So at that point, the people, came to streets and they started protesting, and it really went to the point where the president was forced to resign. Prime Minister was forced to resign. Those who follow Sri Lanka would know that Rajapaksa family has been in power for many, many years, and they were really taken out of the power largely because of the economic crisis, because the frustration really came out to the point where people really went and, asked president to resign. They came in numbers and sort of attacked the president office, prime minister's office, and then finally president's secretariat as well, and that was took over. So it has been quite a difficult era for Sri Lanka, and still Sri Lanka are struggling. For example, even now we don't have enough fuel as much as we'd have liked to, and currently as I'm speaking, there are power cuts in the country, so 2.5 hour power cuts per day right now. And of course it has reduced, and we are at the risk of increasing this to 6 hours in upcoming year as predicted by the power and energy minister. And then the cost of living has increased, many people has lost their job. So it has been quite a ride last few months, and still the crisis is there.
So, Thilina, Umesh laid out the crisis and the escalation of the crisis that's brought us to this moment. A lot of people have put the fault at the Rajapaksa family for borrowing so much to the point where the country just got buried in it. Let's focus our attention on the Chinese part. There's a lot of debt from lots of different sources. The key finding in your report and what got all the headlines is what you talked about, how it was double the amount than previously reported. I want to get into that later on, but put the Chinese debt into context of the other creditors. So we again have a sense of what the context is and the lay of the land is. So we have other bilateral creditors, namely India and Japan. We also have multilateral creditors, and then there are private creditors and there are domestic creditors. Can you give us the context of how all those fit together and where the problems arose in terms of the collapse of the debt problem?
Thanks, Eric. So this is exactly a point where, Professor Deborah, actually one of her key contributions in, guiding us she was like, look, you guys are really digging into the China and, the details locally. Let's zoom out, put Chinese lending in the context of the other lending that Sri Lanka has taken on from the mid-2000s onwards. That is, especially from that 2004 peak point that the Rajapaksa family came into power. So we essentially looked at numbers starting from 2000 itself. at which point, China was less than 1% of Sri Lanka's public external debt. Sri Lanka's debt at that point was mostly to the bilateral and multilateral lenders, mostly on concessional terms. And a lot of that debt was taken over the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to carry out concessional infrastructure projects such as hydropower dams, irrigation, and certain other rural, poverty alleviation programs, etc. But a key event happened in 1997 when Sri Lanka graduated from a low-income country to a low-middle-income country. And that meant that over the next few years, the multilaterals and bilaterals reduced the access of Sri Lanka to concessional financing. So by the mid-2000s, the Sri Lankan government needed to find alternatives to finance their increasing political ambitions of doing a very infrastructure-led growth model. And that was something that was embedded in Mahinda Rajapaksa's Mahinda Chintana political manifesto that was in his presidential election for 2005. It was infrastructure for expressways, for a coal power plant, for the Hambantota port project, a very key project in the Mahinda Chintana, a second, international airport. These kinds of infrastructure projects were a very core part of his political manifesto. But he needed the financing for it, and the multilaterals and the bilaterals weren't going to give him concessional finance anymore. Sri Lanka's access was reducing. And at the same time, he was also going through the escalation of the civil conflict. So that was also creating complications of getting financing from the traditional partners because there were concerns about human rights and all of that. So they found two alternatives. One is accessing export credit from bilateral countries, especially China became a big partner, but other bilaterals also, bilaterals export credit agencies also gave access to export credits. The other financing they found was commercial lending in the terms of accessing the global capital markets. So the one thing they did in 2007 was starting to borrow international sovereign bonds or Euro bonds.
And that's what precipitated the current crisis, right? Was the bonds coming due, not the bilateral debt as much, correct?
Yes. So the bonds from about 2016-17 onwards, we started having a lot of annual repayments coming due on the ISBs. Right, they were maturing, so we had to pay the principal, and that's about 1 billion every year. So that means we also it's vital to go out and issue new sovereign bonds to refinance the maturing ones. So between 2016 and 2019, we actually accessed an IMF program to ensure that we can be on that path to retain access to international sovereign bonds and refinance the maturing ones. And at one point, the international sovereign bonds accounted for about 40% of our public external debt.
Umesh, you make the point in the report that there is no hidden debt, because there's been a lot of discussion in relation to Chinese debt about off-book debt, over the last year or so, and you make the point that you didn't find kind of intentionally hidden debt, but at the same time you also find that whereas many people thought that China's share of Sri Lankan external debt hovers around 10 to 15%, similar to Japan and India's shares, that actually the more realistic number is 19.6%. So that difference, if it wasn't a hidden debt, how do we account for that difference?
This is largely due to the two reasons. One, so let me go back and explain how people come up with this 10% number. So Sri Lanka has few entities that handle the public debt, particularly the foreign public debt. Right, so one institution is what we call the External Resource Department, which is a department in the Ministry of Finance in Colombo. Now, this department handles the government foreign public debt. So they have a classification saying, okay, this is how much you owe to each country. So they are not really focusing on the debt that the government, that the state-owned enterprises owe to foreign lenders. So in their classification, you have 10% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt is owed to China. Now, in that classification, they have clearly mentioned that this does not include a state-owned enterprise debt. Now, what happened in around 2013-14 was there were few big loans that the Sri Lankan government had taken for infrastructure projects. One was for the power plant, Putlam power plant, as Thilina mentioned. Then many loans were taken for Hambantota port. Then there was a loan taken for Mattala airport. So 3 big chunk of Chinese loans, all were from China Exim Bank. At the end of the day, all these assets are actually owned by the state-owned enterprise. So Sri Lankan government used this loophole to transfer this debt from central government debt to state-owned enterprise debt. So by doing that, they could report less public debt to GDP ratio number. So it's not really hidden that debt was transferred to the books of the state-owned enterprise, which still all the state-owned enterprises have to report to the parliament and to other committees such as Committee of Public Enterprise, etc. Right? So this 10% number does not include the state-owned enterprise debt. Now, this state-owned enterprise debt account for a large chunk that are obtained from the China Exim Bank. So that once you add that number, this 10 jump to 15. Now, let me tell the other part of the story is in the classification of this external resource department, they have what we call market borrowings. By market borrowings, you mean you call bids either international sovereign bonds or syndicated loans. Foreign currency term financing facility. You call it both. Now, there were some loans that were obtained by China Development Bank. One loan we obtained, 1 billion loan of foreign currency term financing facility we obtained in 2018, another 500 million in 2020, and another 500 million and 200 million, around 2.2 billion altogether from China Development Bank. Now this debt to China Development Bank is categorized under the market borrowing because essentially at the start Sri Lanka went to the market and they selected China Development Bank as the commercial borrower, right? So those two debts, because those two debts are classified differently, a lot of people thought that okay, this graph says 10%, so then Sri Lanka's debt to China is only 10%. Whereas ERD, the External Resource Department, which I must say has been very helpful for us whenever we submit the information request and data request, they provided us with all the data. We just had to ask the right and specific questions from them. So they have provided the data and they have given the necessary classifications, and they've just done it differently because when you're looking at that number, you went to conclusion that Chinese debt is 10%. So that is how we went from technically 10% to 19.6%.
Let me just see if I understand everything you were saying, just so we can clarify it. So there was no hidden debt, but the way that the debt was classified, either by the government looking at bilateral loans only, not paying attention to what the state-owned enterprises did. You guys said, well, there's one bucket of loans that the government owns. There's another bucket of loans to the Chinese that state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka. You combine those two together. Then there's also the types of loans. There's the commercial lending, which is at a higher rate that the China Development Bank was doing. And then there's also the concessional loans that come from places like the China Exim Bank, and those two had not necessarily been put together. And all of that together comes out to 19.6%. Is that correct? Did I summarize that properly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, let me just add something to this. Okay, you didn't find any hidden debt, but the folks over at Aid Data in the United States at William and Mary College, they came out with a report back in September of this year, which said that China has been issuing what they're calling rescue loans or rescue lending. They listed Sri Lanka as among the major recipients of these loans, and that totaled since 2017, according to Aid Data, at $32.83 billion. Now, they said at Aid Data that these are off-book loans, they're very secretive, and the purpose of these loans is to help prevent borrowing countries who are in debt distress from collapsing. They also said that loans have been issued to Pakistan and Argentina, among a number of other countries. Did your research account for some of these loans that Aid Data discovered?
I'm not exactly sure what Aid Data was referring to, but what this so-called rescue lending, I would say I assume that they were referring to some of these foreign currency term financing facilities, or what we call the syndicated loans provided by the China Development Bank. Because these are not project lending. These are direct money, like they're just, it's very much similar to a Eurobond, except the maturity structure is different. You pay this in installments, you get a grace period, and you have a much lower interest than Eurobond. So, I mean, technically speaking, a syndicated loan from CDB has been a better deal for Sri Lanka than Eurobond. So, as I mentioned earlier, we took one of those loans to assist balance of payment support in 2018, another one in 2020. Government call it an extension of the 2018 loan, and then another loan in 2021, and also a little bit have an addition to that in 2021 September or October. So these are not really classified as project loans, and these are not really classified as bilateral lending, as I mentioned before. But these are recorded. These are recorded as market borrowings because you actually technically went to the market, you called bids, and they were including Indian banks and several other banks which submitted their bids, and then based on the bids, Sri Lanka decided to go with the China Development Bank. And because you went to the market, you categorize this as the market borrowing. So these all are clearly recorded, and it's just that it's recorded differently. So we didn't find any evidence to say like this loan is not really recorded, and all actually were they are very much discussed in Parliament. We in fact were able to obtain the cabinet papers that were submitted requesting the China Development Bank lending.
Thilina, you show that a lot of this needs to be seen in the context of the dominance of international sovereign bonds, in the current Sri Lankan debt crisis. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what they are, and then also like why did they have such a big role in the current debt crisis, and how is that part of it of the crisis being dealt with at the moment?
Thanks, Cobus. Yes, that's important. So the international sovereign bonds that were first issued in 2007. How they operate is that the first 2007 loan is actually a 5-year bond, and we have semi-annual interest payments on that. Every 6 months, interest payments are paid on that. And when it matured in 2012, we had to pay. It was a $500 million loan, so the entire principal payment on that 2012 loan had to be repaid in one go. So that meant our external reserves, if we weren't able to refinance that, would be depleted by $500 million to ensure that repayment happens on that particular day on which we are supposed to repay it. So that's a very big refinancing kind of repayment risk that comes through, right? And that's been the case throughout. But luckily, until 2021, we had market access to be able to go out into the markets and issue new international sovereign bonds and repay the maturing ones, right? Regardless of the interest costs, we were able to do that because we retained access. But in November of 2019, the new government that came in at that point did a very large and, let me use the word, ridiculous tax cut that ruined our fiscal numbers. And with the COVID impact also coming in mid-2020, the credit rating agencies started to downgrade our credit ratings, and we lost access to the market to be able to raise new sovereign bonds. But we were having maturities of sovereign bonds in 2020, 2021, and 2022 continuously, right? At least $1 billion a year. And that meant we were going to be repaying this from our foreign reserves because we can't refinance them now. So we are using our reserves, which also need to be, used for, supporting imports at a time when there is not an ability to go and borrow newly. So because the ISB repayments our foreign reserves were depleting quite fast. And it's in January of 2022, when our reserves were down to about $3 billion, the government decided to repay the $500 million international sovereign bond that was maturing in January 2022, depleting further our reserves. And that meant that by about March, we were essentially at a net zero level in terms of our reserves on a usable reserves perspective. And that is what eventually forced us to announce a suspension on our external debt repayments on the 12th of April of this year. And the repayments on the ISBs, which were that we done on a particular day, and a very large principal payment on their maturity was a big factor in terms of this happening, because the other loans that the bilaterals and even China are given, they're repaid in smaller amounts over a longer period of time compared to the ISBs, so the international sovereign bonds. So the international sovereign bonds puts a much more stress in terms of refinancing and management of our foreign currency reserves compared to other loans in our external debt.
Okay, let's shift our attention now to the Port of Hambantota. This is a big part of your report. Again, you are critical in helping to debunk a lot of the myths around the port. But I just want to start with the very basics, because there's something that I don't understand and I've always been curious about. The Port of Colombo, and I'm looking on Google Maps right now, is 266 kilometers away from the Port of Hambantota. And the port of Colombo, as according to Marine Insight, which I don't know who they are, but I'm assuming they're an industry publication, ranks the port of Colombo as the most efficient port in South Asia and the Indian subcontinent, third in the Indian Ocean Rim, and 22nd worldwide. This is a really solid port. Okay? Why, for the love of what's good in this world, did the Sri Lankan government decide that it needed to borrow more than $1 billion to build a new port 266 kilometers away from one of Asia's best performing ports? Umesh, help us understand the logic of what led up to this loan. Was this something, as the critics contend, that the Chinese pushed on the Sri Lankans, or is this something that the Rajapaksa family said, we want to do because it's in our hometown? This makes no sense to anybody. Help us understand the motivations for what led up to the Port of Hambantota.
Well, let me go back further, around late 90s, early 2000s, during which period Mahinda Rajapaksa was the fisheries minister. And during his tenure as a fisheries minister, Hambantota port was one of the things that he was working on. That was, I wouldn't say it's the first time that popped up, but he was sort of trying to follow it. And of course, he's from Hambantota area itself. And as Thilina mentioned before, lot of votes come to Rajapaksas, or rather, their political narratives have been built heavily based on their ability to drive the infrastructure development as well, in addition to the war. So they really insist on that. It is very clear when you look at their election manifestos. Now, when Rajapaksa came to power in 2005, what we clearly see is that they had a need to build the Hambantota port. I don't think it was Chinese pushing it. China, of course, gave them the opportunity. China facilitated the request of Rajapaksas, which was not really possible before. And Rajapaksa, of course, had he had reason to pursue Hambantota port.
Why? What was the reason? Help us understand what that is.
One thing is that largely because that is his hometown. And if you actually take a look at how much money insanely spent on developing his hometown. For example, he actually built a new airport, which was also funded by China Exim Bank, quite closer to Hambantota. It actually doesn't make any sense to develop an airport, particularly you have another airport.
That is just lunacy.
Yes, and not only that, actually. So he built a cricket stadium in Hambantota, which cricket is the most popular sport in Sri Lanka, for those who don't know. And it means a lot. So you can see that how he serves the electorate. And then also he extended the expressway to Hambantota and further. There was not much of a need of doing this. And also the southern railway line, that also he extended through his electorate.
This is bonkers. I mean, just crazy how much money they were spending on his hometown. So is this just corruption? Is it politics? Is he buying off? What's the motivation? Is it vanity? Stupidity?
One thing is it's for politics, for the votes. He's obsessed with gaining the electoral support in his area. Secondly, yes, corruption too, but the corruption has been involved in the Sri Lankan politics for ages, but for these very specific projects, it's largely because he wanted to show that he's a man who can deliver for the southern part of the Sri Lanka, because he came from the southern part of the Sri Lanka. It is very clear when you look at the videos of starting Hambantota port, and he was very obsessed with declare the port open just before one of the elections. And it is very clear that how much he insists on it, and who actually also the people he had put in charge of Sri Lanka Port Authority, his close allies. This means that it is very much a part of his political agenda.
The story that is told, the kind of shorthand story that's told about Hambantota, is essentially that they took out this big loan from the Chinese, then they couldn't repay them, they couldn't repay the loan, and then in order to kind of deal with that kind of shortfall, they ended up granting a 99-year lease to a Chinese company in order to take, essentially, quote unquote, take over the port, and then also kind of lease an industrial zone next to it. What are the mistakes in that story?
So this story essentially says that Sri Lanka couldn't pay, so therefore we exchanged the port for the debt. That is, firstly, it's wrong. Sri Lanka did not have any troubles paying Hambantota port loans. We have taken 5 loans to construct Hambantota port, including, if we include the bunkering one as well. And the debt servicing cost of these loans in 2017, in the year that the port was leased to China, that amounts to only 2.4% of total foreign debt repayments of Sri Lanka. So that wasn't really a problem at all. So we were not struggling to pay Hambantota port loans. That was not the problem. Problem was, as Thilina mentioned, we were having other balance of payment issues, largely because of we have to repay the Eurobonds that were maturing during that particular period. Right? So it's 2 different transactions. There were no debt written off because of this port loan. Port lease was something separate. People somehow managed to link these transactions together and made it one and build their own narrative. And of course, there are many other narratives that are aligned to this, saying that China took 15,000 acres of land around the port. That is also not true. The basic idea is Sri Lanka had a balance of payment issue, and the lease is separate from the loan. Right, so that is essentially the basic idea. 2 different transactions which was done for a 3 specific reasons. One, because it gave Sri Lanka money, because you needed money for the government. Government was not having enough budgetary finances. We were running on a fiscal deficit. So when you lease the port, you get money. So that money goes to the government. Sri Lanka was able to achieve primary balance the subsequent year. One big reason was non-tax revenue actually increased. And then you had a balance of payment crisis. Because of this port lease, Sri Lanka got dollars. And then finally, by leasing this port to China merchants, Sri Lanka was able to reduce the loss of the Sri Lanka Port Authority, because this was a huge burden for Sri Lanka Port Authority. They were keep making losses and the government has to give them money. And the moment you transfer this to China Merchant Port, it's their business. You no longer have to bear the losses. It's actually like 3 birds in one stone for Sri Lanka.
Cobus, this is so messed up that there's nothing true about the story. And there's an irony here that they turned over the port back to the Chinese in order to pay the Eurobonds, not because they were struggling to pay the port. That's a very convenient fact that is left out of a lot of the stories on this. Umesh, Thilina, this is hysterical, because what you're talking about is just completely different from everything that we know about the story based on the memes that have been out there for the past 5 or 6 years. So, wow. Thilina, in the contracts, there was also suspicions that there were asset seizure clauses. And this has been a concern of Chinese loans and ports in places like Kenya, where there were concerns also that should the Kenyan government fail to pay the loans on the standard gauge railway, they would seize the port of Mombasa. Your colleague at the China Africa Research Initiative, who you wrote this paper for, Deborah Baudegem, has been on the forefront of debunking this. Now you have debunked it in Sri Lanka. Tell us more about the asset seizure clauses, or if there were any, in the China Exim Bank loans for Hambantota.
So first of all, we were very grateful for the Ministry of Finance's External Resources Department for allowing us access to these loan agreements, the 5 loans that Umesh mentioned earlier that were taken to build the Hambantota port complex, that they gave us access to go through these and give us these loan agreements to go through when we put in a right to information request. And that's the key thing. The reason why this research has been enabled is back in, I think, 2016 or 17, we had this Right to Information Act, under which we can write to public institutions and request for this information to be provided to us as citizens of Sri Lanka. And that's what's enabled us to do all of this. And speaking into the specifics that you asked, we did not find specifics of asset seizure clauses or having liens on the assets that are created through the loans, or some kind of collateral, the port as a collateral if the loan is to be not repaid. We didn't find any such clauses in either of the 5 port loans. The first loan that was taken in 2007 and the subsequent loans that were taken from 2012 onwards, we didn't find any such clause in the 5 loan agreements.
Umesh, I wonder if you could, well, both of you actually, if you could just reflect a little bit on your perspective on the debt renegotiation process as we've seen it so far. Like where, like as Eric mentioned, there's a lot more attention being paid to the role of China in it than to many of the other actors, including bilateral lenders like Japan and India, and international sovereign bondholders, which are frequently all over the world, but also particularly kind of also legally located in Western countries frequently. So I was wondering, like from the inside of Sri Lanka, like what is your perspective on the debt renegotiation process at the moment? Like maybe Umesh go first, and then Thilina can follow up.
We are actually still in the early stages of the debt restructuring process, and as you mentioned, it is clear that China has to play a big role because they obviously have like 1/5 of the debt, 1/5 of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. Now, the where this gets complicated is that, as you mentioned very early in the podcast, Japan and India comes into the picture. India in particular has their own interest with Sri Lanka, and they were not really quite happy with significant increase of Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka. So they would be very closely looking at what China agrees into. And from Zambia experience, we know that China is not really fond of principal haircuts. I mean, the scholars who have been talking about Chinese banks, they also say that Chinese banks do not like principal haircuts, they prefer maturity extensions. Now, for Sri Lanka, this has not yet been finalized, and we are still in the process of negotiating, and we haven't reached, I would say, anywhere in terms of that as of yet. Now, I think this going to be a little bit complicated also because Sri Lanka had borrowed from different Chinese entities and different Chinese loans. Thilina can add on to this. We have borrowed from China Exim Bank and as well as China Development Bank. Now, how is China Development Bank going to restructure their debt would be vastly different to what Exim Bank would want, because these are very different loans. As we mentioned and explained, China Development Bank has provided different kind of lending. These are not project lending. And CDB also had provided project lending as well. So we still need to figure out how these complexities going to be resolved. So there's going to be consensus within China and within those institutions that come together and finalize this, the debt restructuring negotiations. But for me, the biggest stumbling block is that there are countries that are with contradicting interest, that is more than a debt problem, that is also a geopolitical problem, particularly for Sri Lanka because of the India's involvement, and there's likelihood that the negotiations might drag longer. Because if you take a look at Zambia, a country like India doesn't really have, or Suriname, they don't really have much of a geopolitical interest. But for India, they have huge geopolitical interest on Sri Lanka, and their ties goes way back, and they're very politically involved in Sri Lanka, to the point where like one of the constitutional amendments in Sri Lanka is actually forced upon the country by India, rather suggested by India. So there's very close ties with that, and there's going to be a very geopolitical problem doing.
I mean, the reason why China's role in terms of what China's approach to debt restructuring is critical right now for us is that we are at the stage where we are waiting. We've gotten the IMF staff agreement, and we need to move to IMF board approval so that we can have an IMF fund program and thereby have access to other multilaterals also being able to lend to us new. And for the IMF to provide board approval, we of course have the prior actions on the domestic side. The government is meeting, and the government's done a lot of domestic kind of changes. Fiscal side, taxes have been increased, electricity prices have been increased. The domestic side is happening. But the other side of it is that we need financing assurances from the bilateral creditors primarily, and start good faith negotiations with the private creditors. So the good faith negotiations with private creditors are ongoing. The debt advisors are proceeding with that. And on the bilateral side, we are having the negotiations, but we need some kind of consensus among the bilaterals on what their approach is. So that consensus is taking time. We've seen that in Suriname and Zambia that it took time for that initial we are okay for this country to be in arrears to us as bilaterals. The IMF can go forth to, on its funding program. But the issue that's popped up now is that Suriname's program has so far just essentially gone off the rails because none of those financing assurances, especially from China, and then the good faith negotiations with the private creditors, the ISB holders, none of them have gone anywhere. So the IMF can't proceed with Suriname's program. And that means that for Sri Lanka's program to start off, everyone's now expecting a bit more details from the bilaterals, including China, India, and of course the others, to give some details before we move ahead to the IMF program. And that is causing delays because China, internally, we don't see that they've actually come to, what their consensus approach as these different institutions that Umesh mentioned, the China Exim Bank, the China Development Bank, and some of the other commercial creditors, which are not major in Sri Lanka, but quite major in the African countries, for them to have that unified approach to what this debt restructuring is, what is our standard approach, how much of, at least maturity extensions and how much of interest rate reductions do we do, even if principal haircuts is not possible, because bilaterals usually do not give principal haircuts on their debt. So at least that, maturity and interest rate reduction, maturity extension and interest rate reductions would be an approach to take. But they need to come to that consensus, and that is taking time. So that is a big delay, and that's meant that the delay means a lot of space for a lot of speculation and to feed in, and that's happening quite a lot. And even domestically, we are seeing kind of, narratives of why isn't China being helpful now when it's been, it's supposed to be a friend for such a long time. Why can't it, be helpful right now? So that kind of, conversations is going on. And that doesn't help to get China on the table in good terms if we are being antagonistic to the Chinese.
And that might explain why the messaging last week coming out of the foreign ministry from both Zhao Lijian responding to that question, and then also Mao Ning, the other spokesperson who said China's calling for joint efforts to ease Sri Lanka's debt burden, might be a signal that they're ready to start engaging into a multilateral process, and they don't want to be blamed for holding up the process. Again, that's speculation, I don't know, but it was just interesting to me that twice in 1 week Sri Lanka came up in the foreign ministry briefing, which is unusual for that. The report, everybody, is Evolution of Chinese Lending to Sri Lanka Since the Mid-2000s, Separating Myth from Reality. If you follow these issues, if you've been following the debt crisis in Africa and in the Americas and other parts of the world, this is an absolutely essential read because it really debunks a key part of the narrative about asset seizures. And the Port of Hambantota is, again, that is patient zero in all of this. So it was written by Umesh Moramudali, who is a lecturer at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka, where he focuses on public finance and political economy. Also, Thilina Panduwawala, who is the head of economic research at the private economic advisory firm Frontier Research, also in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Gentlemen, thank you both for shedding some light on this. I know both of you are active on Twitter, fighting the good fight to debunk a lot of the bad information that's out there. Thilina, where can people find you if they want to follow what you're doing on Twitter?
I think it's at Thilina Kalhara on Twitter. Yeah.
Okay.
Go as Thilina Panduwawala, I think, full name.
Don't worry about the details. I'll put a link in the show notes. Umesh, do you know your Twitter handle?
Yes, it's my name, Umesh Moramudali. You just type the name without any spaces. That's me.
Wonderful. You'll see links to both of their Twitter handles in the show notes, as well as a link to the report. Thilina, Umesh, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having us. It was a pleasure talking to you all.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you for having us.
Cobus, I just can't believe what I just heard. I mean, I'm kind of speechless about the whole thing because the narrative is so far removed from the reality. It's ridiculous. And really, the next time you see anybody talk about the Port of Hambantota and you ask them and you say, have you read this report published by Kerry? And if they say no, forget them. Just walk away. It's not even worth the time. Okay? So it's hysterical to me, again, that they had no problem paying back the loan on that port. The problem was they weren't able to pay the Eurobonds. And here we are back again at the Eurobonds and at the private creditors. Same issue that we face in Africa. Okay. And there's been no movement, no budging on that, and nothing coming out of the US and Europe saying that they're going to work with their legislatures to ease some of the fiduciary laws on debt repayments from private creditors that are governed by New York and UK law. Nothing. And that is just, it's crazy to me. And the other point that really stood out for me was how responsive the Sri Lankan government was to their requests. This should be an example for every developing country. Scratch that. Every country. That citizens and researchers can go to their government and say, let me see the loans. Let me see the terms. Let's see what's under the hood here. And as far as I know, the sun came up in Colombo the next day after they released the documents. So this should put the Kenyan government to shame for what they've done over the SGR loan. Shame. It's absurd because Kenya is violating their own laws. And all these other developing countries should look at what Sri Lanka's done and said, yep, that's what we need to do. Because when you put sunshine on this, you at least know what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, many times in many podcasts, we've made the call for kind of radical transparency, from global south governments, from regional organizations, like calling for all loan contracts to be published, and they should. I think this whole kind of crisis makes that clear. But it's also, in relation to your earlier point, I think it's true. It's like the thing is I'm not a finance expert. So I really kind of come to all of this from a place of, how does a layperson kind of understand this? And as a layperson, I've now read, kind of many pages of Financial Times, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, kind of all of this kind of mainstream coverage of this. And it is striking for me how frequently, one would read these accounts from very, very high-level financial journalists, quoting very, very high-level financial officials from Western countries, where no one even acknowledges that Western-held bonds are even an issue, are even part of the conversation. Kind of where one would read page after page, article after article, just simply assuming that, China's the only big problem here. If only China would cooperate with these people, then all of these poor little countries would be able to move forward. And, this is not a kind of an instance of whataboutism, to justify China's position, because China has a lot of problems in China's position. But for Western officials and Western kind of reporters to really downplay the role of Western, kind of like private financing institutions in all of this is really problematic, I think. And it's something that strikes me particularly in relation to how all of these poor countries are going to do anything about climate change, kind of like what their financing options are open to them. And the fact that the role of international private capital is so complex and has so many pitfalls for these countries, and that these pitfalls are then not addressed at all by Western officials, that's a bad combination.
No, and to your point on the media, which is very interesting, how they will repeat the Sri Lanka Hambantota line so casually as if it's a fact. And let me just quote you from back in, this is Financial Times, back in January. This was a really big report published by Catherine Hill, who's the Taipei correspondent, and David Pilling, who's the Africa editor at the FT. China applies brakes to Africa lending. That was the headline of the story. Then deep into the story, they have a line here, and this is, I think, what you're talking about. And I'm going to quote here. They point to Chinese control of Sri Lanka's Hambantota deepwater port through a 99-year lease as evidence of Beijing's presumed designs on strategic assets in Africa. Okay? That's just repeating.
That line has had legs. We've been chasing that line since then.
That's right. But the fact that reporters as esteemed as Catherine and David put that into their story just gives it so much credibility. And yet, as we heard today, by the way, these two researchers, as incredible as they are, this information has been out there in some form or another for quite some time because we've been saying this. So this isn't like the first time that people knew about this when this report came out. They gave it shape and definition that we hadn't seen before, but a lot of this had been known prior. And again, Deborah Browdegim has been a leader on this at Carey. And so when David Pilling starts repeating some of this stuff in his reports in the FT, which has this immense credibility in the financial media space, then others follow that example. So again, I think when we see these references by the likes of David Pilling and others, we need to call them out on it because it's just not accurate. They need to then publish corrections on it. Now, again, all journalists, me included, we make mistakes. Okay, sure, fine. But now we have enough information out there with this report that's published on the Kerry website. It was covered by Bloomberg, by FT. Everybody knows that this report is there. If you want to just use a frickin' Google search, you can find it. So there's no excuse now for this Hambantota line to have any legs after this. None. Now, again, Chinese lending has a whole bunch of problems. We're not trying to defend Chinese lending here. We're not trying to excuse it. We're not trying to kind of rationalize it, do whataboutism. We're just trying to point out that what Thilina and Umesh have uncovered indicates that the narrative as it exists now, that is propagated by India and in many Western countries by both politicians and media, is just not accurate. It just isn't accurate. So to me, the great contribution that they've made is by, again, the transparency and putting facts out there for all of us to see.
And then also, in the case of Sri Lanka, the government made some bad decisions.
No, Cobus. They didn't make bad decisions. It's bizarre how bad that, and they deserve, at the end of the day, the Rajapaksa family should be accountable for this.
But at the same time, I think what this also shows is that poor countries, like formerly colonized poor countries, that are now facing, not only the general kind of problem of trying to develop when you have no infrastructure, but also the much larger problem of trying to develop while you have no infrastructure when there's also a massive climate collapse coming, that these countries do not have enough options for financing. It's just like, even if you make really good decisions as a small poor country and not falling into the pitfalls that Sri Lanka did, you still don't have many options. And that, just the kind of dearth of financing options for countries as they're facing this kind of completely out-of-the-box crisis kind of bearing down on them, that itself is such a scandal that I'm surprised, although not surprised, but still, kind of like it's notable that it doesn't occupy more of a media attention,
Yeah, and the part of this story where the Chinese should be held accountable, I get the sense that they learned from their lesson here, is that when the Rajapaksa family came to the Chinese to say, we want to build a port 266 kilometers from one of the best performing ports in all of Asia, in fact, all of the world, the Chinese should have said, that's ridiculous. What a stupid idea. And we're never going to get our money back because that's way too much capacity for a country the size of Sri Lanka. So the Chinese and their lack of due diligence in evaluating these loans, I think, is to blame. Now, one of the things that you will look at the trajectory of Chinese lending through the Belt and Road Initiative is that 2017 in many ways was the high water mark. And since 2017, it has just cratered off. And in many ways, I think that Hambantota for the Chinese was a sobering moment. And that's when I think that everything kind of changed. I think there was a big learning lesson for them. I think it was around that time that Xi Jinping sent in some of the anti-corruption kind of units to start cracking down. That's when they also started asking for stronger feasibility studies. And you kind of got the sense of like, ooh, we don't want to get into this again. Because it all kind of wraps around that time. And so, again, there is no direct line between Hambantota and the cutoff in BRI spending or the demand for better feasibility reports. But at the same time, I think there was some correlation just based on my experience.
I think that kind of accumulation of controversial projects, that the Standard Gauge Railway and so on, kind of started kind of raising concern in China. And, what we also saw during the same stretch of years, and then the COVID shutdown, I think to a large extent, provided a kind of a reset period. But what we saw just before COVID is also the issuing of much, much harder kind of guidelines in terms of environmental, social, and governance, kind of standards for Chinese projects coming from the government and Chinese-led multilateral institutions. All of that seems to be response to mistakes made. And I think my guess, and this is just a guess, is that I don't think we've seen the end of quote-unquote Belt and Road, however we understand the Belt and Road concept going into the 2020s. But, whatever name that lands under, I don't think we've seen the end of Chinese infrastructure spending. But once it kind of picks up, once the global economy kind of picks up and they have more space, also domestically, economically within China, I think one will see quite different terms, of how this lending will work. And the kind of interactions between global South governments and Chinese authorities will, I think, probably change.
And I have to admit that I am not very optimistic that Sri Lanka is going to emerge from this process in very good shape. I think Umesh was being quite diplomatic and scholarly when he was saying that China and India don't get along. And that's an overstatement or an understatement of just enormous magnitude here. Let me just give you a quote that came out from our good friend Tuvia Gehring, who is a researcher in Israel, and he follows Chinese academics and think tank discourse quite closely. And he's got an absolutely essential newsletter called Discourse Power that everybody should be signed up for. And he found a quote from Liu Zhongyi, who's the Secretary General of the Research Center for China-South Asia Cooperation at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. And SIIS is one of China's leading international think tanks. And so Liu, here's what he said, and just listen to the tone. As long as India doesn't make excessive demands or overuse the G20 and SCO summits that it'll host in 2023 to peddle its own agendas, China will support it. And then Liu then applauded India for attempting to ease bilateral ties and correct, here, quote unquote, its misguided China policy over the past 2 years. Okay. I mean, that does not bode well for that kind of tone coming out. And the thought of the Japanese, the Indians, and the Chinese sitting down in some kind of kumbaya moment to help, Sri Lanka out it's far-fetched. I mean, it's been difficult in the Zambia context and the Ethiopia context, which are not anywhere near as politicized. But one cannot overstate and just exaggerate how tense the relationships are among these three countries. 2 of those 3 countries are members of the Quad, right? That are really aggressive towards China. So it is hard to imagine. And we heard this a couple months ago from our China researcher, from Han Zhen, our China researcher, who was telling us that public opinion in China on social media is also not entirely favorable to a bailout or some kind of concessions in Sri Lanka. So there's domestic political pressure on the Chinese to maybe not give in too much, and again, to not take those haircuts. So lots of different angles to consider with this. But Cobus, again, I will not have a conversation with somebody, a serious conversation with somebody who talks about Hambantota unless they've read this report. That's my takeaway.
I'll be citing this report for years to come.
That's for sure. So I am so glad we had a chance to do this. This is exactly what we try to do on this show. This is what we try and do every day in our daily news coverage, is to kind of uncover, lift up the rock and see what's underneath the rock. And that's what we found today in this show. We hope that you found it as enlightening as we did. You can get this delivered every single day into your inbox if you go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We're just about to raise our rates next year, just a smidge. We've had a lot of demands, so we feel comfortable that we can raise our rates just a smidge. We want to support this really growing international journalism organization that we've built. We've got editors now in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and we have a brand new climate editor who's just joined our team as well. We're thrilled to introduce you to Protus very soon as well, who's going to be covering climate issues in Africa and in the global south as well, with a strong Chinese focus. So all of that requires support, and we're just so grateful to our subscribers and our Patreon supporters, to all of you. Thank you so much for your support. If you, again, would like to join what we're doing and to get our newsletter and to access our site and to get transcripts of the podcast, once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the show. Until then, for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.